In modern politics, power often reveals itself not in dramatic explosions but in subtle shifts, and few recent developments illustrate this better than the way Donald Trump's threats, especially those aimed at Canada, have quietly lost their impact. On the surface, it seemed like another round of tough rhetoric, another promise of tariffs, renegotiations, and economic retaliation. Yet what followed was not panic, not collapsing markets, not scrambling diplomats. Instead, there was an unusual calm. That calm is more than just a lack of reaction. It is the signal of a deeper transformation. Trump did not change. His style, rooted in pressure and unpredictability, remained intact. But the world around him evolved. Markets, institutions, and global actors learned not only to withstand political turbulence, but to anticipate it, absorb it, and ultimately neutralize it. To understand why this matters, we have to look back at how Trump's strategy once operated. His political success was built in part on shock. When he threatened tariffs, markets reacted immediately. When he questioned alliances, headlines exploded. Governments adjusted plans out of fear of sudden economic disruption. This unpredictability created leverage because it forced others to make the first move. Canada experienced that dynamic firsthand during earlier trade disputes. A single statement could rattle industries, disrupt supply chains, and trigger political anxiety. But shock only works as long as people believe every threat could transform into reality at any moment. Over time, repetition transformed fear into expectation. Markets began to see patterns. Some threats escalated, others evaporated. Many were diluted by legal constraints or institutional resistance. Financial systems, built on analysis and historical memory, adapted by developing tolerance. Investors stopped treating every announcement as an emergency. Instead, they asked, will Congress back this? Will courts allow it? Is it sustainable? Does it align with broader economic policy? The answers increasingly were uncertain enough that panic no longer made sense. So when Trump reprised aggressive language toward Canada, warning of economic pressure, and punitive trade measures, markets did not tremble. Investors monitored, but they did not retreat. Analysts discussed, but they did not predict catastrophe. Canada did not scramble. Rather than forcing capitulation, the threats landed in a world that had grown resistant to them. Trump did not lose power in a single moment. Instead, the political and economic environment simply stopped reacting in the ways that once amplified his influence. Political institutions also evolved. Washington had been through cycles of turbulence before. Agencies, courts, and lawmakers had confronted sudden shifts and headline-driven policymaking. That experience taught them a crucial, stabilizing instinct. Not every crisis requires an immediate, visible response. Institutions slowed the pace. They defaulted to process. They waited for tangible action before mobilizing. This patience served as a quiet counterweight to rhetoric. Meanwhile, Canada chose resilience rather than confrontation. Canadian leaders avoided emotional escalation. They communicated steadiness to businesses, reassured industries, diversified export relationships, and strengthened ties with partners beyond the United States. Rather than framing Trump's threats as existential dangers, they treated them as part of an evolving geopolitical landscape. This strategic calm mattered enormously. Threats rely on reaction. When the target refuses to panic, the pressure weakens. Trump continued to assume that shock would still shock, and that the symbolic power of U.S. dominance would compel rapid concessions. But the world had become multipolar. Nations have new alliances and alternative trade networks. China offers investment opportunities. The European Union presents economic partnerships. Regional blocs provide buffers. In such an environment, economic leverage shifts. A threat from Washington is influential, but not absolute. Countries now weigh American pressure against global opportunity, and many discover that standing firm no longer guarantees disaster. Financial markets experience their own intellectual transformation. Instead of responding emotionally, they systematized political risk. Analysts integrated Trump uncertainty into long-term modeling, treating it as a recurring weather pattern rather than an existential storm. Just as an airline incorporates turbulence into flight design, global finance recalibrated systems to withstand waves of rhetoric. Stock indices stabilized faster. Currencies fluctuated less dramatically. Commodities began reacting more to structural supply and demand factors than to inflammatory sound bites. This resilience did not mean politics lost relevance. It meant politics became one variable among many, not the sole driver of economic fear. And crucially, this change exposed limits in Trump's approach. His strategy rewarded escalation. Yet escalation without results eventually erodes credibility. Markets began to differentiate between performative threats and executable policy. Investors realized that courts might block overreach, international partners might counterbalance pressure, and long-term fundamentals often outlasted political drama. Once this realization took root, the incentive to panic evaporated. Canada's experience embodies the power of quiet adaptation. Rather than reacting loudly, Canadian officials leaned into consistency, signaling reliability to international investors and trade partners. They strengthened domestic industries where possible, encouraged diversification, and used diplomacy instead of outrage. This did not mean abandoning the relationship with the United States. It meant refusing to make national policy hostage to any single administration. Over time, that approach transformed vulnerability into bargaining strength. The more Canada demonstrated stability, the harder it became for external threats to destabilize it. This is not an example of confrontation defeating pressure. It is patience defeating volatility. It shows that steady institutions, clear communication, and diversified economic structures can blunt even aggressive tactics. What emerges from this story is an unexpected conclusion. Institutions did not collapse under the weight of unpredictability. They adapted to survive it. Courts clarified boundaries. Legislatures asserted oversight. Bureaucracies emphasized continuity. Trade systems reinforced collaboration. None of these changes were dramatic. They unfolded gradually, almost invisibly. But collectively, they redefined how power operates. Instead of allowing rhetoric to define reality, systems defaulted to process, evidence, and long-term planning. That shift represents a quieter kind of strength, not the spectacle of decisive, sweeping control, but the discipline of endurance. Power in the 21st century is becoming less about commanding immediate obedience and more about shaping environments that remain stable even in turbulent circumstances. Some observers argue that because nothing catastrophic happened, nothing meaningful occurred. In truth, the absence of collapse is itself the revelation. We witnessed the exhaustion of a political tactic. Fear lost its efficiency as a policy tool. Shock lost its guarantee of leverage. The international system developed antibodies. Markets began rewarding predictability. Citizens grew accustomed to volatility. In that environment, dramatic threats no longer reshape reality on their own. For Trump, this became a strategic miscalculation. He continued to wield tools designed for an earlier era, assuming that America's economic dominance remained unquestioned and that partners such as Canada would feel cornered. Instead, the global system demonstrated that resilience is now distributed. Influence flows through networks, not just commands. Even the United States must negotiate within constraints created by interconnected economies, multinational institutions, and domestic legal limits. The lesson for future leaders is profound. Spectacle is losing its ability to move systems. Durable power now belongs to those who can build trust, sustain alliances, and maintain stability across uncertainty. Leaders who rely solely on disruption may still capture headlines, but they will struggle to shape outcomes in the long run. Those who understand collaboration, institutional respect, and strategic patience will likely prove more effective. Markets respond more reliably to credible planning than to dramatic improvisation. Diplomacy achieves more through long-term alignment than short-term intimidation. And citizens increasingly recognize that resilience, not noise, provides real security. Trump's failed threats toward Canada therefore represent more than a single diplomatic episode. They reveal a turning point in global political behavior. They illustrate how democratic systems, financial networks, and allied governments collectively learn to resist reactionary politics by refusing to be governed by fear. Instead of yielding, they absorbed pressure and continued functioning. Instead of panicking, they recalibrated. This does not mean the world is safe from instability or authoritarian impulses, but it does suggest that institutions possess greater adaptive capacity than many critics believed. They can bend without breaking. They can evolve without abandoning democratic principles. And in doing so, they redefine what power looks like. Ultimately, the most important detail is not that Trump made threats. He had done so before. The revelation is that the world listened carefully, evaluated the signals, and chose not to flinch. Markets steadied. Governments remained calm. Canada stood firm. That collective refusal did not just weaken a tactic, it announced a shift in the architecture of power itself. Power is no longer measured by how loudly a leader speaks or how quickly markets tremble. It is measured by which systems can adapt, endure, and continue governing effectively, even when confronted with chaos. In that sense, the failure of Trump's threats marks the quiet rise of institutional resilience, a force that may shape global politics long after individual leaders fade from the stage.